So we're going to take a look at the psoas muscle, strip away all the muscles, strip away the body, and just look at it in a kind of 2D format to try and understand it in 3 dimensions. And what we're dealing with, basically, is a pelvis, a femur with a lesser trochanter, and a spine. Now, I'm not taking a sagittal plane view because, generally people understand that a hip flexor flexes and therefore to stretch it, you extend it. And bear in mind that we also have to extend the spine if we're going to get some length there. So we know that we need to kind of take the femur back in extension and take the spine also back in extension to get some length in the sagittal plane of the psoas. In the frontal plane, it's much more curious. We don't necessarily have a direct access to understanding what it does in the frontal plane or how to get it to stretch. Often that's a little bit of a sticking point for people. But if we look at the shape of it, and I kind of urge you to look at anatomy as shapes. I think shapes and the way they move gives everything away, as opposed to getting bogged down in the detail of what a muscle looks like, where its striations are, where it starts, stops. Look at its shape. Movement is about shapes. And if we just take a little look at the psoas in its shape, you can see this kind of S shape. We have this kind of S shape in the frontal plane, which I think is the S shape that kind of gives the movement in essence away. So as soon as you look at a diagram like that, it becomes obvious. So if I've got a muscle that attaches on this side of the spine, most of you are going to tell me, if I was to ask the question, which way am I going to stretch that muscle? Everybody points that way. Everybody says, let's go that way. So if this is the right leg, we're going to end up with a left lateral flexion in order to put some load in the tissue, lengthen the tissue on the right-hand side. Similarly, when you look at the attachment site here on the lesser trochanter, we're going to see, I'm going to ask you the question, which way would you want to move that in order to get a stretch? And everyone's going to point this way. 100%. Everybody does it. You're all clever people. So we end up here with taking the femur away from the midline, gives us an abduction. Now, just on slightly another note, which is that abduction doesn't necessarily have to happen with the leg being moved away from the midline, but can also happen by virtue of tilting the pelvis like this, which leaves a net lateral flexion away from it in the lumbar spine. So we kind of get our abduction here by increasing this angle as opposed to moving the foot. So this keeps the foot on the ground and moves the pelvis and the spine around it to get our frontal plane load in the psoas. The final plane to look at is the transverse plane. And this is an area where there's often quite a lot of debate. And I'll openly put my own hand up and say, I think in the transverse plane, you can get a stretch both ways. So any muscle that hangs longitudinally like this, will actually can get a stretch in both ways. Normally we're creating a torsion in order to get some length in that tissue, as opposed to lengthening the distance between the 2 points. So again though, look at the left-hand side, the right-hand side of the spine where the fibers attach. If we actually rotate away from that, you're going to feel that stretch that comes across the hip. It almost feels an abdominal stretch, but as you can see, this is right up into the abdomen. So we're going to rotate away. Oh, I've put R, that should be an L because it's a left rotation away from the psoas on this side. And we want to counter that. So if I was to rotate the femur in towards it, we'd actually be sending the fibers all in the same direction. If we send them all in the same direction, that to me suggests that there's very little lengthening happening at all, because if you move two things equally at the same speed, then there will be no length tension change. So what we find is that if we get the opposite movement in the femur so that we actually have a right rotation in the right leg and a left rotation in the spine, is we get a really big stretch which opens the femoral triangle and creates a big three-dimensional stretch for both the body, the tissues in this area, and in particular the psoas. Now, due to its attachment on the lesser trochanter, we can argue that some internal rotation will create a stretch there, and then I think relative to its position in the pelvis, its journey through the pelvis, this is where the debate arises. In human movement, there is a moment where the hip flexor is fully stretched, or the body is in the position that I've just written here, extended, left laterally flexed, left rotated, with the leg right rotated, abducted and extended, and it happens critically when we're toeing off. So if you walk around toeing off, you'll notice that you should be getting a hip flexor stretch. If you're not, do the exercises in the video and you start to feel it, and it will promote more efficient human movement. Okay, so we're going to look at the muscles in the Now It's Your Turn section of the book, first starting with the psoas, and I genuinely hope you've had a go already working this out for yourself, because a big part of our courses and this process is that you get to experience this stuff in your body before we actually tell you what it is. We like to let your experience create your learning. So if you are on the other side of the coin there and you are not, or you're watching this before you've actually worked it out, then please do make sure that you get this into your body before moving on, because it's a really big thing. So many people tell me that their therapist has had them stretch their hip flexor, and I'll take a single look at them and they're not actually stretching the hip flexor, or it's such a small stretch on the hip flexor that it's got hardly any punch to it at all. So we really want to see the hip flexor stretched in all three planes. We're interested in its sagittal plane stretch, its frontal plane stretch, and its transverse plane stretch, and we're also interested in critically where it starts and stops. So the psoas itself starts on the femur and stops up on the 5 lumbar vertebrae. So it's actually important that we see what both of those structures do. They both move in 3 dimensions, and when they move together, we get a big stretch of the psoas stroke hip flexor complex. So it feels very different to a classic kind of runner's hip flexor stretch that most people are prescribed. So if I take Chris and pop him in the sagittal plane so we can have a look at it side on, we know that the hip flexor attaches on the lesser trochanter of the femur and on the 5 lumbar vertebrae. So what you should have come up with is that in order to get some length into the lower fibers of the psoas hip flexor muscle, we need to extend his hip. And I think that's everyone's happy with that one. So we'll start with that there. In order to do that in movement, I'm just going to get Chris to take his right leg forward, which symbolizes taking his right leg forward in gait. So you can see that there's actually a hip flexor stretch going on every step we take as well. So here we've got, if I just ask you to lift your arm up onto your shoulder for now, we've got an opportunity to assess the pelvis and its relationship to the femur so that we can actually check if he is genuinely extending his hip here. A lot of people don't. If you've got people with anterior tilts, you might lose that completely. So are they really getting a sagittal plane hip flexor stretch? Next, onto the lumbar vertebrae. So I want him, hopefully you will have came up with that we actually want to extend the spine. So we get a nice extension. Rather than ask him to lift his rib cage, we're going to get him to stick his arms up in the air and take the hands backwards to create a lift in the rib cage, giving a nice stretch in the abdominals, which is a clue as to kind of what's coming next. So as I then get Chris to just flex his right knee, he should be moving in and out of this stretch in the sagittal plane. So he's getting more hip extension and more spinal extension just with every knee bend and every arm reach. Now, just something to be aware of, because a lot of clients will do this, is you'll ask them to reach their hand back and they'll bring his head back, collapsing into the lumbar spine. Now, this is a problem. This is a problem because we're no longer extending the spine, we're over extending lumbar vertebrae while having 0 extension in the thoracic. So you need to be aware of that. We want equal extension in each section of the spine, as opposed to one big compression in the lumbars with no action happening higher up. Okay, so a nice clean sagittal plane stretch. We're going to get length through extension of the hip, extension of the lumbar vertebrae, and then from that maximum position, hold that there a second, whoop. Don't worry if they wobble. From that position, the muscle is in a position with no option but to contract back into a hip flexion and a spinal flexion, which will get him to stand up tall again. Okay, so then we'll put Chris in the frontal plane again. So this is your observation of the frontal plane. Because now we're going to look at what movements are available at the hip in the frontal plane. So you might not be used to thinking of hip flexors as a frontal plane muscle. The movements available at the left hip in the frontal plane are basically adduction, bringing the leg towards the other leg, and abduction, bringing the leg away. And the movements available in the spine are for the spine to laterally flex to the right and laterally flex to the left. So knowing that the muscles are on the inside, the lesser trochanter of the femur, and the left-hand side of the spine means that we get an idea of exactly how that is going to stretch. So if I'll start in the spine because it's generally easier. In order to lengthen the fibers of the psoas on the left-hand side, we're going to actually take Chris into a right side lateral flexion. At right side lateral flexion, we'll see the fibers of the psoas lengthen through the left side of his spine. Again, I could simply promote that with the left arm up in the air. Left arm just reaching high, to not across, but high to avoid any compression of the lumbar vertebrae. As he reaches high at the same time as he bends his knee, we can actually bring in the sagittal component we just talked about and the frontal plane component at the same time. Now we can see that the fibers of his psoas are lengthening in the frontal plane. Now what about at the hip? This movement of the arm will create a relative drop of the pelvis on the same side. So as the pelvis drops, it's the angle that changes in the femur. Without actually moving the femur, we actually get an increase in the angle space here, which is what gives us our abduction. So by taking the leg away, or by causing the pelvis to lift on the right-hand side, we get an abduction of the hip here, which will give us our full lengthening at the hip in the frontal plane. So if Chris then reaches high, bends his knee and allows his pelvis to drop, if your client can't drop their pelvis, they can't stretch their hip flexor. And then we can see that there's a nice lengthening in the frontal plane. If he's extending in his spine as well as expanding in his hip at the same time as laterally flexing to the right and abducting to the left in the left leg, then he's now got a big two-plane stretch on his psoas major muscle. Finally, into the transverse plane. So transverse generally we'd be looking down from above, which is quite hard to do in the camera setup. But transverse is rotational. So again, we're going to take that knowledge that it's attached on the inside of the femur and attached on the lateral side of the spine. So what we should hope is, I'm just going to pop Chris's hand here. So again, I'm not asking him to rotate, I'm asking him to influence a rotation. So he takes his left hand and reaches towards his right hand side. You can actually see in the t-shirt the creases. It's not just the t-shirt that stretches, but his psoas as well as some abdominal fibers, which we'll look at again in a minute. So critically here, if I get him to rotate his spine to the right, I'm going to get the fibers in the transverse plane to lengthen as they move further and further away from the femur on his left leg. And then at the same time, for instance, if I actually rotate his thigh towards it, we're going to close the gap between the femur and the spine. So that actually takes his transverse stretch away. What we are interested in doing is making that bigger. So as he rotates right, what if I can just get his femur to come more and more and more to the left at the same time? It's quite critical now as to what is happening in the foot at the same time so that we can get the load here in his hip flexor. Once again, your psoas is reliant on foot function. Now, I'm going to change his arm positions. Arm up to the top again, so I can have him reaching high to get our frontal plane. I can have him reaching backwards to get his extension. And with his right arm out to the side, rotating to the right is going to get the spine moving in the 3 dimensions that will get the psoas muscle under tension, under load, or in a stretch. And at the same time, if he's moving his right knee forward, getting the extension, the drop of the pelvis to get the frontal plane stretch at the hip, and the lateral rotation of the femur, all at the same time. Just move in and out of that for us, Chris. You should find that you get a really big hip flexor stretch, normally much, much bigger than what you're used to, certainly what your clients are used to. And even Chris, poor little chap, is shaking away like a good one here. So it's hard work, it's a good workout, but we're really promoting good human movement. Make sure you connect your hip to the foot. More about that later.